Good morning, everyone. This is Alexandra Metters from galacticconnection.com, and I have an on-the-fly interview today, an urgent request by none other than Kevin Annett. If you would like to jump on his website while you're listening to this, it's at itccs.org, and he has some really great news today, actually very inspiring, because it's truly showing that the light is prevailing. So for those of you who are not familiar with Kevin, he is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee for 2013, 14, and 15. Wow. He's also a community minister, human rights consultant, and special advisor to the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, which is what ITCCS stands for. He also is an award-winning documentary filmmaker for that which is entitled Unrepentant. That was back in 2007. He's also an author, and I could go on and on. This man never stops blowing me away with his power and his dedication and his commitment to exposing what I consider to be the most vile virus on this planet, and that is the constant attack of our children and of our species, and the feeding off of through satanic ritual, etc., through churches and ritualism. So anyway, Kevin, we made it.
We did. Good to be back.
So, wow, you have a lot to say, and I kind of want everyone to understand that this is really, really big news that he's come across. And in fact, it's so big that he couldn't wait to get this out today. I personally feel I'm not going to be saying a whole lot because there's too much to review, but what I did want to say is he is going to be discussing a memo, and this is the quotation that he put out yesterday. It says, "This memo explains why the first independent inquiry into residential school crimes in June of 1998 was so effectively disrupted and halted, and why so many key witnesses have been shut down or even killed since 1998. This memo shows how the enormous black ops and smear campaign against ITCCS and Kevin Annett is connected to this covert program by the Canadian government, and that it is still killing off Native people today. It all confirms an enormous and deliberate travesty of justice by church and state in Canada to conceal their own crimes." And this is also written, apparently, right, in the Murder by Decree book, right?
Right.
Kevin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, exactly, Alexandra. And the reason that happened is because of the memo that was released this past week to the ITCCS office. This is coming from a civil servant within one of the intelligence organizations in the Canadian government. Essentially, what this memo did was it came out on April 3rd, 1998, and it said to the Liberal government at the time of Prime Minister Chretien, it basically said, we have to shut down any independent voice, any activist trying to campaign on the missing or murdered children, any independent inquiry, and especially the eyewitnesses to these murders have to, and their quote is, has to be either contained or eliminated. That's the wording of the memo. Now, this memo went to the Prime Minister's office, 3 senior cabinet ministers, and it was adopted clearly because when you look at all of the events at the time, that's exactly what was going on. This memo came out just 2 months after we had held our first mass meeting ever held of residential school survivors in Vancouver, 2 months before the June 1998 tribunal. That was the first tribunal ever held in Canada into the residential school crimes. And the same month that the British Columbia Supreme Court had brought in the first ruling saying the government and the churches of Canada were guilty of all these crimes and were liable under the law. Now, obviously the government panicked and they said, look, we've got to clean out this whole situation quick. And clearly they authorized a regime of state terror, which claimed the lives of at least 9 of our own people who were killed by police. This is all being discussed elsewhere. All of this, including the so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a huge whitewash, all of that came out of that one memo, April 3rd, 1998.
Hey, Kevin, stress to them who these 9 people within your organization were, because you very specifically notate that they were on your front line.
They were. These are all 9 Aboriginal people, men and women, who mostly homeless people that I come to know over the years, but they had all survived Indian so-called residential schools. They had seen killings. They had taken part in burials of children. They were at the front line. So when we were holding church protests, for example, one of them, Bingo Dawson, he led the occupation of Holy Rosary Catholic Church in February of 2007, which led directly to the apology. It was these church occupations that were forcing the government to come around and start paying lip service, at least, to the fact that these children had died. Now, Bingo was beaten to death by 3 policemen. That was eyewitnessed by another person who was also killed after. William Coombs, who saw Queen Elizabeth take 10 children out of the Kamloops residential school who were never seen again. He died of lethal injection at St. Paul's Catholic Hospital. Now, all of this is happening after this memo, and it's not accidental because the government had authorized all of these actions.
That's incredible. And now you also mentioned something about they were literally dictating the memo that they harass the citizens if they go into any type of campaign situation, correct?
That's right. I can read from part of the memo, one of the extracts.
Yeah, I think you should.
itccs.org. This is what the memo says. A growing unrest among West Coast Aboriginals associated with the litigation presently before the Supreme Court may lead to the rise of splinter factions that seek to exploit public sentiment over the United Church residential school disclosures. Protests and other direct actions by the Native Youth Movement and the group associated with ANIT, yours truly, and Nahanni, that's Harriet Nahanni, have already been planned in these circles. Any independent investigations by these groups into burial sites near Alberni Residential School could spell disaster and must be stopped, get this, through special ops conducted by the usual RCMP units and private contracted parties.
Wow.
The living Aboriginal witnesses pose as damaging the security risk to the government and the churches responsible, as do such investigations. These witnesses must be contained or eliminated, unquote.
And that's actually in writing in this memo that you got your hands on.
The memo is presently held by the ITCCF's office in Brussels, where I assume the eyewitness is gone. I'm assuming he's not in the country because that's usual protocol. When you have key witnesses, you bring them out.
Sure.
For safety. This witness has agreed to go on record. That is, he's going to be filmed, whether that's anonymously, like his face blacked out and voice muffled or whatever. He has agreed to go on record, and this memo is apparently going to be circulated quite soon.
That's crazy. Now, flip back to the historical ruling that the Canadian government had when they basically said that the church and the state were both equally liable for these crimes against.
Well, I know really well about that because it was just a couple of years after I was fired by the United Church for bringing this stuff out on Vancouver Island. But I was asked to be a consultant in the first lawsuit. It was called the Brenner decision in the BC Supreme Court. And it basically looked at all the evidence that I helped to provide and other people have given it. And it said the United Church and the government are equally liable for all of the damages that happened to these children, not just physical and sexual assault, but the death of children, reports of torture and medical experimentation, all of these things that were surfacing. And what my research was also being published at the time and was all bringing out, they were found liable in the Brenner decision, June 1998. Well, I mean, at that point, within a year, the floodgates had opened and there were thousands of lawsuits that had been commenced against the Catholic, the Anglican, and the United Church. So it just blew the whole thing wide open. And clearly this memo is a response to it to try to shut the whole thing down.
Interesting. And so have you had any feedback from those actual lawsuits as far as what the decisions were?
Well, the thing that the government did after that is they stepped in after consulting in the back room with the churches, and they did what they did in Ireland and any other place where this stuff came out. They legally indemnified themselves, which means they agreed that nobody would ever be prosecuted. And in return, they would give out a little bit of money to various selected survivors and call that healing. But the survivors would have to sign off any legal action against the churches and government. So it's a way to really tie up the whole thing and keep it all quiet. But the significant thing about all this is that it didn't just happen randomly. It came from a government order. it came from an official act of state terrorism, and they're responsible for the deaths of all the people subsequently because of that.
Oh my God. So this is huge because you actually have a piece of testimony, you have proof, you have evidence. You know, you've always suspected this. I mean, every time I've interviewed you, you already knew because you were in the thick of it.
You know, you can suspect things, you know, you can see patterns because of, you know, what's going on, but it really hit me home when I saw this, just at a personal level, not because of these friends I've lost and other things, but, you know, the whole massive smear campaign that's gone on for years against me and the ITCCS, again, it's coming out of this memo, because part of a black ops operation is you target the most public, the most forceful people, and start a rumor campaign about them, which you can see all over the internet. It's still there. And people would often say to me, well, how could that smear campaign go on over years unless it was well-funded and well-organized? And well, here we see where it's coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's all different, you know, what I have found just through the intel that's come through Galactic Connection, there's all different types of factions with different agendas to bring down the child pedophilia. But then there's all this attached agenda to it rather than just the purity of let's save these children.
Exactly.
And let's bring out the truth. And what do you think about that?
Well, you know, that's exactly right. And you find out very quickly who's running according to ego and who's genuinely committed. I love that quote, that whoever seeks the truth must be as humble as dust. I think Gandhi said that. And it's true, you have to, in all humility, ask yourself all the time, are you doing the right thing? And that tends to keep you on course. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons that I published Murder by Decree, The Crime of Genocide in Canada, which people can get at Amazon now. And it's to show all of these things that were concealed. All of this, the information that was deliberately censored out by the government's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that's all in this book now. And, you know, I always publish things without copyright because it's public knowledge. It needs to be out there.
Right on, right on. And, you know, the other thing I wanted you to share with everyone is what are the sorts of actions that they took to silence the people other than the lethal injections, you know, the heart attack, which was probably some sort of ray gun and that kind of thing. What were the typical modus operandi, not just from your frontliners, but from the classic, you know, trying to shut down the journalists, you know, any kind of newspaper coverage? What do they normally do in that scenario?
Well, you see, in kind of the mainstream so-called wide world, it's easy to shut people down. All you have to do is accuse somebody else of being crazy. And that's usually does it, especially in Canada. You know, I call it the C word. You call somebody controversial up here and it's like, whoa, forget it, we can't talk to them. Very different than an American reaction. But, you know, usually that's enough. Like, and we know that the RCMP went to Vancouver reporters all during this time that we're holding our tribunal when the memo first came out. And they said, you know, you can't trust Kevin Annett. He's making it all up. He doesn't have any proof. None of the natives work with him. All of those lies. But if you're a reporter, who are you going to believe? The RCMP or some defrocked minister, right? Who are you going to believe? The entire church or one lone individual? So with most people, it's relatively easy to get them to turn the other way. But if it doesn't work, you can start doing things like, you know, threatening their income. We know that every United Church minister was told not to come to my defrocking hearing or they'd lose their pension. They were told that. But,
wow. I didn't know that. I don't remember you ever telling me that one. Wow.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much. It's hard to recall it all. But
they really have cojones, don't they?
Well, you know, you can when you have a lot of money behind you and you think you're God. But the point is, they're also very vulnerable because they know they're guilty. And if you go to itccs.org and go back, not the latest posting about this memo, but the one before it, there was another very important breaking story about this independent missing people's inquiry happening right now in the west coast of Canada. Now, what this memo that just came out said is that the same RCMP units that, you know, took out the people back in 1998 and stopped these inquiries, they're still active. They are still driving Native people off their land at the behest of Chinese and American corporations. They're working with these private contractors who are really, you know, hit squads, you know, as every corporation has these things, to terrorize Native people off their land. So these crimes are not stopping, they're continuing. And in fact, if you read in that report, we found hard evidence that Chinese companies are operating right now, doing that kind of thing in British Columbia as part of a policy of colonizing the area with Chinese settlers. That's hard evidence from people on the ground who've seen it happen.
Well, you know, and that I was going to ask you about who received this memo. I noticed there was a liberal Prime Minister, Chretien, is that how you say it?
Chretien, Jean Chretien.
Okay. And an Assistant Prime Minister Gray, Minister of Indian Affairs,
Jane Stewart.
Jane Stewart and Minister of Justice and an Attorney General, Anne McClellan, who we've talked about before. Can you give me an idea of who are these people? What, you know, why is this sent to them? What is the protocol as far as when they receive something of this nature?
Well, they're part of what's called the Privy Council in Canada. Like, it's a colonial system in Canada. The Governor General is the Queen's representative. And the Privy Council, they make the laws. About 80% of all laws passed in Canada are not passed by the legislature, by Parliament. They're passed in order in council, which is a bunch, 6 or 7 people sitting around drafting a law and saying it's law. And so, you know, the Privy Council, this inner circle, now all of those 4 were part of the Privy Council. So again, it's like the legislation that brought in the Indian residential schools and all these crimes. They're all in council. They're never debated in Parliament. The people don't know anything about it. And what's significant about those 4 people is the Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, and Anne McClellan, the Justice Minister and Attorney General. They're both, at the time, and they still are, shareholders in Power Corporation and Camco, which is the biggest uranium company in Canada. And they have a vested interest in driving Native people off their land. In northern Saskatchewan, the U.S. military gets depleted uranium from those uranium mines, and they've got to terrorize the natives off their land to get it. And those people had a vested interest in that memo because they knew by wiping out the native opposition, they were lining their own pocket. So that was very significant about those 2 individuals.
I was going to say, just the fact that those names were on that memo was, in my opinion, huge. Now, is this still going on a very major scale, or have they toned things down a bit as far as, you know, not only abducting children off of the reservations, but also more and more children are being removed for the purposes of child sacrifice and that kind of thing?
Well, the thing to know here, Alexandra, is that it's all become so institutionalized. The child trafficking operates right in the government system, just like it does in America or anywhere in the world. Vulnerable mothers, single mothers are targeted. They're criminalized, especially if they're Native, because they don't fall under the law of Canada. They're under the Indian Act, where they're not citizens but wards of the state. So you can do whatever you want to in India under the law, and there won't be a repercussion. They seize the children that way and traffic them all over. But there's also been, as you saw with the release of this so-called Truth and Reconciliation report, there's this massive mind control program going on in Canada now where you hear of reconciliation all the time. We've made up with the Indians. We're all healing and reconciled now. Aren't we good? Justin Trudeau, the new, the kind of cool-looking young prime minister, he's the epitome of that fact. It's this massive brainwashing, make people think none of that bad stuff is happening anymore, when in fact, when that kind of thing goes on, you've got to be all the more vigilant because you know it's happening all the more. That's just the fog and mirrors they put out to distract. And it's like with the new Pope or Obama when he came in, it's the new window dressing to fool people because most people don't look past the window dressing.
Yeah. Now, and do you have any new statistics as far as how many children you're now finding are missing and or murdered?
Yeah, in that second report in itccs.org, if you go back one, you'll see in there that the initial report of there's some people on the West Coast who are doing their own count of the missing people. And it says that it's much higher than was originally estimated because in the original police report, they would find individual Aboriginal missing women who had gone missing for years and then report them. They didn't look at the entire community or the whole pattern, they just looked at certain areas. When you look at the whole province, there are literally hundreds of Aboriginal women, and not just women, but their entire families that have gone right off the map. They just vanished. And this is a massive disappearance going on the level of Central America or China or any of the places where people, there's state terror going on to just drive people out of the area, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are going missing all the time. And again, this is to clear out British Columbia of natives because, look, a quarter of the hydroelectric power in North America comes from that province. The resources, the oil, the uranium, the mining, the water, which is a key resource, all coming out of Western Canada. So that's where the final step of genocide is carrying on. This is what this is all an indication of.
Wow. And any report, I haven't talked to you in so long, anything coming out of the Vatican, you know, any word from them?
I'm glad you mentioned that because in one of the other reports we put out recently, a Catholic archbishop in Quebec has just announced that no priest is allowed to be alone with children anymore.
Wow.
It came out in the Guardian newspaper on June 24th, and we commented on it because it's interesting. The very guy making that announcement, suddenly priests can't be with children, which when you think about it is an amazing admission of guilt.
I mean, and the fact that whether they'll even implement it is a question mark, but it's great that it's being stated.
Well, yeah, and the guy's name is Archbishop Chretien. And if you remember, a couple of years ago, the ITCCS stopped a child ritual killing in Montreal by the Ninth Circle. Yeah. And Cardinal Gerald Lacroix was named as somebody who was participating in that and in one in Rome at a Jesuit church. This Chretien is a confidant of Archbishop Lacroix, and in fact, his name was discovered in material related to the Ninth Circle. So in other words, the man who himself is being exposed as a participant in child trafficking and murder suddenly announces to all of his priests, you can't be with children anymore. That to me is somebody who's in a panic mode, and it's kind of like shooting yourself in the foot in a big way, saying, yeah, it's dangerous for children to be with Catholic priests. That's a sign, you know, as Sun Tzu would say in The Art of War, that's the sign of an army about to collapse when they're doing those kinds of things.
Yeah, and that feels the case around the world, doesn't it, Kevin? The news around the world is just, it's ongoing. It never stops lately. It's just one exposure after another.
Well, that's right. And you know, their house of cards is coming down in a big way. And these are all signs of it. These are all tips of the same iceberg. Another example, in Altoona, Pennsylvania, there's been an investigation into child trafficking in the Catholic Church there. Well, the grand jury that it was convened a couple of months in April has just released a report, and I can send this to you. The grand jury report says that the Catholic Diocese of Altoona and Johnstown has a secret archive of all of the records of priests abusing children. That archive is under lock and key of the bishop. And the bishop, Stephen Reka, his name is, he is ordered not to ever release that. Well, the grand jury's investigators got into the file and they found that, in fact, this secret archive is standard policy in the Catholic Church. So what that's confirming is what we already knew about this policy of crimen solicitatis, where every Catholic in the world is ordered not to ever tell the police about child abuse. The prosecutor said this discovery is tantamount to a broad system of planned criminal conspiracy to aid and abet child traffickers. So they're finally acknowledging from that one case in Pennsylvania, something that goes on everywhere, that the Catholic Church is a criminal conspiracy protecting child rape.
So really, we're really making some progress here. You know, it feels good. How about the whole story out of the Netherlands? Anything going on with the...
Well, it's interesting because the thing that just I got to notice when this other stuff came from ITCCS about the government memo in Canada, what they said was in Brussels, if you remember, there was a politician named Laurent Louis.
Yes, that's who I was alluding to.
Yeah, he stood up in the Belgian parliament. He accused Mark Rutte, who is the prime minister, of being a child trafficker and a child rapist. He was thrown out of parliament despite his immunity. They made sure he was never reelected. He faced imprisonment and €50,000 fine, all of this trumped up charge. Well, he's back in action now. He's running again for office. He's raising this whole thing again. He's, for the first time in years, getting media coverage again. And, you know, they have big demonstrations over there. I remember there was like 10,000 people protesting outside the Belgian parliament when this stuff came out. I mean, I can't even imagine 100 people in North America going into the streets for a child rapist, let alone 10,000. So, you know, it shows you that this stuff is never suppressed. It always keeps coming in waves like the tide. And we're definitely on a high tide right now.
That's huge. And when you get stories like that, send them our way so Galactic Connection can put them out there. Seriously.
Well, I try, but Skype and Facebook and my emails have been under serious attack.
Oh, I know that. And, you know, I'm using Zoom today and I have no problems, and yet I can see that it's being messed with. Mm-hmm. You know, if you haven't already noticed. Now, you talk a lot about common law, bringing forth the new common law republic, and de-establishing the Crown Authority. What's going on in that arena?
There's been a lot of off-the-radar stuff going on. We've been, for example, in Ontario, there's 3 different areas where we've been holding training workshops for people who want to learn the common law, to convene common law courts, to train as sheriffs, to enforce these warrants. So there's a lot of that grassroots work going on now. There's more people doing the training, which is very encouraging. Now, the next big step is to get them active in doing not just the things like the citizen arrests of known child raping priests, for example, but actually going to town councils and saying, you know, it's time to withhold taxes from the federal government because they are part of a criminal body. Keep the money in the community, convene your own assemblies. That kind of direct action locally. I remember when I was, a few months ago, I was in Sacramento giving a workshop. And people there were saying, well, that's exactly what we need to start doing over these smart meters. You know, just say to the local town council, we're not going to allow these things anymore. You've got to take responsibility here. So we find at the local level, it's more possible to take that action, give people a sense that they can do something in their own community.
There's definitely a lot of action being taken on the grassroots movement level, especially with the sheriff's departments. A lot of people are interacting with them face-to-face, really trying to educate them, and they're being very receptive in certain parts of the United States in particular. I'm going to talk about that's really promising. That is very promising. I do still intend to assist you, Kevin, in throwing one of your workshops here in SoCal. I would just need help, and we do have some volunteers stepping forward to assist us. So we can still pursue that, you know.
As the September approaches, we're starting a new speaking tour by me and other people across North America and then over to Europe. I've been invited to Prague to speak at a conference in October with David Icke and other people.
Cool.
And so I'll be going over there. But the big focus in September will be I'll be going to the campuses, pushing my books, and holding these workshops. So we can easily arrange stuff in California or wherever.
Right on. And now, right now, are you actively involved in your radio show still? Are you still doing that?
Yeah, I meant to, thank you. Radio Free Canada.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, Radio Free Canada has been offline for a number of months, but it's coming on again. It's coming online September 4th. So I just wanted to plug that for people. Sunday, September 4th, 3 p.m. Pacific, you go to the BPS Radio Network and it'll be online. So we can talk more about that. We've got a number of good shows planned.
So just so everybody hears this, sorry about that, there's a telephone going off and I'm not at home at the moment. So can you clarify again that your actual radio show is on Sundays at?
Yeah, it's Radio Free Canada, Sunday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern.
Perfect.
bpsradio.com/Radio Free Canada, Kanata.
Perfect.
Again, write to me, hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com. We're already planning the programs, which are going to have a really clear common law focus, but also a very focused spiritual content this time as well.
It's so important. It's so important, folks, because a lot of people don't want to read about this information. And I don't really honestly enjoy talking about it either, but it's a necessity for us to keep our eyes open because this truly is the root, in my opinion, of all evil. this is where it's at. And this is where all the light workers around the world need to be continuing to be vigilant and doing your light work to bring this network down. When we bring this network down, it's over. It's game over, seriously. One last thing, you know, since you're a scholar of the Bible, a lot of people talk about the satanic influence of this network versus the Luciferian influence. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see the difference between those two?
Well, it's kind of like touching the elephant. In some ways, they're referring to the same thing. Of course, Satan simply means adversary, because in the Bible, Satan was not the opponent of God, but his servant, who's used by God in the world to test people. Lucifer, light bearer, again, you know, because Christianity and Judaism, they're coming from two different traditions: the monotheistic tradition, where God is both good and evil, and the dualistic, like where the Cathars and others came from, which is that, no, you've got two forces in the universe, one good and one evil, and they're fighting each other all the time. Yes. So we have all those ideas mixed together, and it really influences the way we see, you know, these terms, Lucifer, Satan, all that. But for me, the bottom line is, what do these groups do in practice? We know that groups that call themselves satanic, Luciferian, are actively engaged in child sacrifice. It's part of their lifeblood. We know that the elites are engaged in this on a routine basis. So, you know, like whatever you call it, it's the same evil. And I think it's important not to get caught up in the terms, but strike at the practice, and understand that all of that is about the degradation of human beings and the loss of their own inner spiritual light, are dehumanizing. And so I mean, that's generally how I approach it. We could go into that for a whole show, but it's kind of my opinion.
Be interesting. I think everybody would be really interested in that. I'd love to also review just biblically how that is paralleling what's going on right now on the planet. There's some very, very interesting morsels there. Well, is there anything else that you need to relay today?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention again to people my two new books, Unrelenting, Between Sodom and Zion, and Murder by Decree, The Crime of Genocide in Canada, which is also up online, murderbydecree.com. You can get both books at Amazon or createspace.com. I often, you know, try to get these books with me whenever I go on tour, because whenever they go into libraries in Canada, they disappear within a week or two. We've even, in the Vancouver library system, sent out a directive not to carry these books. So, you know, it requires the people listening, just people on the ground ordering these things, to get out this really sacred history of what really went on. Because if we don't understand that, we can't understand what's going on today.
Yeah, and don't forget, you know, David Icke, for years and years and years, couldn't get his books into any library or bookstore, and now they're all over the place. So your time will come, you know?
Oh, yeah. Well, I see this shift happening everywhere, so I'm not.
Yeah, so I just want to thank everybody for listening. I know that this sometimes gets really a little intense for us to hear about this type of information, but really good for us to have our ear to the ground and hear about the victories that are occurring and some of the exposures that are finally being presented to the world, and through someone such as Kevin, who has an impeccable, in my opinion, impeccable sense of integrity. So thank you once again. Please don't forget to visit his murderbydecree.com website to check out his books. I have both of them. They're very, very detailed accounts of what he has found through his investigations of those that have been murdered or have disappeared. Okay, and as always, please continue to support galacticconnection.com. We have our daily blog 365 days a year, and we have hundreds of interviews on the YouTube channel, Vimeo, and you can also check us out on BBS Radio. So stay tuned. We'll be talking to you soon. Hopefully next time we have this interview with Kevin, maybe, just maybe, it will have stopped. We have toppled and cut the head off of the, what is the beast.
Then I can take a vacation.
Yeah, you and me both. A vacation? What's that?
Yeah, really. I've got a few places in mind.
Okay, everyone, lots of love. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again, Kevin.
Hello, this is Kevin Annett, and I'm speaking to you from Davis, California. I am here today to talk about two of my new books having to do with genocide in Canada, but also the broader crime of child trafficking, crimes against humanity by church and state. The first thing I want to talk to you is a series of incidents in Canada where we began to uncover the remains of children who had actually been killed or died in Indian boarding schools. Now, I know of this topic because for the last 25 years, I have been in the forefront of a campaign to document and expose these crimes and also prosecute those responsible in the Catholic, United, and Anglican churches, the Government of Canada, and the Crown of England and the Vatican. And in the course of interviewing many hundreds of eyewitnesses to these crimes, I realized that we weren't just talking about the kinds of crimes that are allowed to be in the corporate media all the time. For example, crimes of the physical and sexual abuse of children are thoroughly reported, but what aren't covered ever in the so-called mainstream media is the fact that those were tips of the iceberg. The main crimes against Native children, both in the United States and Canada, had to do with a concerted plan of genocide, of how to wipe out entire nations by attacking their children. We know that from the records that I've unearthed and published in books like this latest, Murder by Decree, The Crime of Genocide in Canada. Many of the documents in here show that the average death rate in the Indian boarding schools was over 50%, over half a century. And with that enormous death rate, it's not the result of random acts of abusers. There's a whole plan of using germ warfare, spreading tuberculosis and smallpox among children and then never treating them. That was a standard practice in these so-called schools. And so the death rate was enormous. The body count was over 50,000 plus children who never came back from these places, and a much even higher level among American Indian schools from the limited research I've done. The question that faced our investigation early on was, where are these children? Where are they buried? We know in many cases from eyewitnesses, from written accounts that we published, reports of Indian agents and others, that the standard way of getting rid of dead children was to actually burn them up, incinerate them in the furnaces of these Indian schools. We have that from eyewitnesses. If you go to our site, itccs.org, that's the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, itccs.org, you'll see an eyewitness account there from a Cree woman, Irene Favel, who, as a little girl, actually saw a newborn baby thrown into a furnace by a Catholic priest at an Indian school in Saskatchewan in 1944. We have many of those kinds of witnesses who buried children, who helped incinerate the remains, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, early on, we know that it was more commonly the practice of actually burying children on the grounds of the school. We've documented 28 mass grave sites in Canada alone, mostly in Western Canada, where hundreds of the remains of children were buried. Now, one of the things that prompted us to publish this book, Murder by Decree, this year, is that the Canadian government deliberately censored out many of the records of those killings and has downplayed the level of murder in these schools. For example, the Canadian government's so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission claims that only 3,000 or 4,000 children died over a century. Now, that would require a death rate of between 1% and 2%, an absurdly low figure, since their own records, which we published, show that 40 to 50 to 60% was the norm. So they're even contradicting their own records. Early on in the first half century of the Indian schools, so that was from around the 1880s to after World War II, or around the time of World War II, the standard practice is to bury the children on the grounds of the school. And as a result of that, we were invited, and I was invited personally, by the Mohawk tribe near Brantford, Ontario, in the late months of 2011, to come and, with the full authorization of 10 elders of the Grand River Mohawks, I was asked to come and investigate the site of the Indian boarding school mass grave site there. And we brought in forensic specialists. We surveyed the grounds with ground-penetrating radar, found massive soil dislocation right on the very spot that eyewitnesses said they had helped bury children. And with the authority of Bill and Cheryl Squire, the authorizing elders, we began to conduct an archaeological excavation there. Within about 2 hours of digging on the site where those children were buried, we uncovered the remains of bones and school buttons off the school uniforms. These bones were sent, there were 16 separate bones. They were sent off to the Smithsonian Institute. Dr. Don Ortner examined them, and he said in a series of emails to me, which again we published, he said that he was 95% sure several of these bones were from the body of a small child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, probably a girl. And he wanted very much to come and investigate further. The Mohawks wanted him to come up. He was scheduled to come up, and then 2 months later he died of a sudden heart attack. Whether that's coincidental or not, I'll leave it to you to figure out. He was the first top-level forensic pathologist who was scheduled to come and actually examine this first excavation of Indian residential school gravesite in history. So in effect, not surprisingly, the criminals of church and state shut down the hard evidence of their crime. But that doesn't, in fact, stop what happened. It confirmed that, yes, there are children buried in the ground. They're still there. We know that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have gone around and systematically unearthed and destroyed many of these sites. And in a broader sense, the Canadian government has even authorized the destruction of all evidence, including documents. We know that because just this month in April 2016, the Ontario Court of Appeal in Canada actually authorized the Canadian government to destroy any evidence of residential school testimonies in their possession. So in effect, if you can believe this, one of the highest courts in Canada has said it's okay to destroy evidence from a crime scene, the biggest crime scene in Canadian history involving the mass murder of Indian children. So it shows you that the government is actively concealing their crimes, and especially the crimes at these mass grave sites. And we know it's in direct response to the publishing of this work, Murder by Decree, because in it, as you'll notice if you go to the site on murderbydecree.com, you'll see there a lot of the evidence that the government, in fact, censored out. The eyewitness testimonies, the records showing that half the children died in these schools consistently, decade after decade. That was a plan of extermination under the guise of religion and education to get the lands and the resources. And that's not unusual. It happens all over the world. If people are surprised it happens in Canada, it's only because they're ignorant of Canadian history, the real history, and are taken in by this beneficent, image that Canada likes to project to the world. We know, in fact, that the mass murder of Indians in Canada happened even more effectively than in the United States because it happened more secretly and under the guise and the control primarily of the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of England, and the United Church of Canada. Which was my former church that expelled me when I began to uncover these things. So stage 2 of this whole story is the fact that after the shutdown of that Mohawk dig we conducted, we were invited to Europe with that evidence, and the next year in 2012, we began an international common law court trial into these crimes using this evidence from the Mohawk dig and many of the other documents that we published. So I'll be discussing that in a separate YouTube posting, but I think it's very important for people to realize that these crimes are ongoing. We've documented it, itccs.org, murderbydecree.com, and we are continuing the investigation into the further disappearance of Aboriginal women and children that's happening all over Canada, but especially in Western Canada, at the behest of foreign corporate interests, Chinese and American companies that are forcing Native people off their land to get the uranium, the oil, the water, the hydroelectric power. So please follow the work at itccs.org and stay tuned for further postings about these vital issues. This is Kevin Annett. I thank you. Hello, it's Kevin Annett again. I'm in Davis, California, and I'm going to talk for a little bit today about how our movement to expose genocide in Canada went to Europe and helped set up the first International Common Law Court of Justice, and how it is that common law can be used as a real weapon by the people of any community to fight their oppression, to fight the abuse of their rights, their children's rights, any issue that's harming their liberties and their well-being. For me, the whole issue of common law was kind of abstract. I had studied it when I took some year of law school, but I didn't really understand the power of common law until I had to be in a situation where we were confronting both church and state in Canada for their proven crimes of genocide. For many years, we attempted to bring these cases of the murder of Aboriginal children into Canadian courts, and we were rebuffed time and again with the same argument. We were told that courts in Canada had no authority to put their boss, if you like, the Crown of England, the one who had appointed these judges, to put those groups on trial. In effect, so-called sovereign leaders of church and state could not be tried. Now, that was inaccurate, of course, because under international law, anyone can be tried for a crime against humanity, or even for any kind of tort or civil offense. But what we realized was there was a lot of political forces at work to stop that from happening. So I mentioned previously how we uncovered evidence of the murder of Indian children at the Mohawk Indian School, including physical remains that we had unearthed. The next year, we were summoned to Europe to bring that evidence before an international tribunal. And when that tribunal looked at that hard evidence, including documentation and testimonies from people showing clearly that genocide had been committed, they were looking for a technique and a method for how do you put heads of church and state on trial. Not just trying individuals, but how do you put a whole institution and mindset on trial, that whole culture, if you like, that was responsible for the mass murder of children and that continues to perpetrate genocide around the world. What the answer was that it's possible to invoke common law to convene a court to do exactly that. So the first step was easy. We had a lot of evidence. We had the eyewitnesses and the documentation, and really those two factors is all you need in any court of law. And we also needed the structure. So what we did is we established a genuine court of record with 58 citizen jurors. Now, we put out the call for citizen jurors by publishing what's called a notice of claim of right, where we stated the case that that these perpetrators had committed crimes. We named 30 defendants, including Pope Benedict, who subsequently resigned as a result of this case, which is not accidental, Queen Elizabeth, the Prime Minister of Canada, and many levels, officials of church and state. These people were summoned into the court. None of them responded, which was an admission of guilt under the law, and it was considered that by the court. And there was a prosecutor's office set up that really their job was to gather the evidence and the case. And this chief prosecutor actually presented the case to the citizen prosecutors, or rather the citizen jurors. They were in 9 different countries, so they were linked by Skype call, which was perfectly legal. You can do that in a court. They don't have to all be physically present. Although with local common law courts, we urge, because it's local action, that people in fact do have a physical location where it's established like a regular court. But in this case, the International Common Law Court operated that way. The case went on for 3.5 months, and the evidence was exhaustive. And again, there was no attempt by the defendants to ever respond. We even invited them to help in the jury selection, to respond as well to the evidence. They never did. They did not contest the evidence against them, which is very important legally. And after 3.5 months, the 58 citizen jurors decided unanimously that yes, they were all guilty on the 2 counts of the indictment, which was committing crimes of genocide against whole cultures and against children, and concealing that crime in a criminal conspiracy to destroy or subvert evidence, in effect to obstruct justice. All of the people named by the citizen jurors were found guilty. The verdict was that they were sentenced to 25 years in prison in absentia with no possibility of parole, and that all of their property and assets were forfeited. Now that's very significant because it meant that the Crown of England, the head of the Roman Catholic Church and others had lost their authority to govern, and it meant legally that anyone at that point could go in and seize the assets and property of those corporations lawfully. Now, in the arrest warrants that were issued, it authorized any citizen to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, Pope Benedict resigned within 2 weeks of that verdict coming down, because even though most of the people of the world don't realize it, the heads of those corporations know that the verdict of a common law court can be acted upon by any court in the world. So all of a sudden, any court in any country could take the evidence and issue arrest warrants. So it really wasn't, people were saying to us, well, have you arrested the Pope yet? Well, no, it isn't our job with our meager resources to do that. We prove the case. But any police agency in the world can. And that's the power of these court verdicts, common law court verdicts, because any government and court around the world can then act on it. And so it's like a loaded gun that we're handing to the world. And these heads of church and state know it, which is why they've stayed out of sight very much since these verdicts have come down. They don't know whether or not the people of the world will act on this, because the thing about enforcement with the common law court decisions is that every citizen in the world is the enforcer. It isn't up to a sheriff to go in and do it. Any citizen can and should enforce these verdicts. So that's another very powerful aspect about these common law courts. In terms of relating our experience of the common law court in Europe to the work of anyone trying to set up a common law court, there's a couple of things to remember. We were effective because not only did we have the evidence, we had public opinion and we had a lot of media exposure. And so we were able to build a real groundswell. We didn't act in a vacuum. We were able to bring immense public pressure to bear on this issue because it had to do with massive child trafficking, proven crimes of genocide. So if you're conducting any kind of court case, let's say on something like smart meters, you've got to have your ducks in order. You've got to have the evidence lined up. You've got to have the witnesses lined up. And you've got to have a clear villain. You've got to have not just the system in general as the defendant. That doesn't work in a common law court. You've got to name individuals. The old saying that evil has an address. You've got to name that address. You've got to name who's responsible and summon them into the court. Then the fiduciary heads of corporations, government leaders. In the case of, for example, chemtrails, you should definitely third party the heads of the companies, the U.S. government, the people who are allowing these crimes to happen. And that's very important. And once you have that evidence, you go public with it. And so you turn the common law court into a great public arena. You invite the public in. You say anyone with evidence, come into court and share that evidence. It's an enormous theater, if you like, but in a good way, in the sense that you are using the one weapon we have as people, which is public exposure in numbers. There's two things that any corporation, whether it's church, state, company, whatever, two things they fear, and two things to which they will respond, regardless of how small you are. A threat to their money and a threat to their public image. And you've got to strike at both. You can't appeal to their conscience. They don't have one. They're a corporation. You can't appeal to somebody in the system to help you, because by and large, as we found with child trafficking, they're all working together in these crimes, and one official will back up the other automatically and will come down on you. So your best protection is public exposure in numbers and embarrassing these people as much as possible, which is very easy to do because they know they're guilty and they are guilty. I document in my book, Unrelenting, Between Sodom and Zion, many of the steps that we used in bringing this common law court into being. So you can get that and our book, Murder by Decree, The Crime of Genocide in Canada. You can get that online at Amazon.com, through our website, itccs.org, murderbydecree.com. Also, for establishing common law courts, there's a very precious resource that we use. It's online at itccs.org. If you look in the right-hand column, it'll say Community Training Manual, Common Law Training Manual, and the first draft of how to go through the steps, the 12 steps of setting up a common law court. People in Davis have copies of that. We'll be issuing new versions of that, and actually in pamphlet or manual form for people to disseminate and learn from and add to based on your own experiences. But in terms of those 12 steps, it's very important to first issue the statement of claim of right that says, here's the case, here's the defendants, here is what they're guilty of, and That's the basis upon which you issue a call for jury members and start the ball rolling. It's important to remember in the case of in the course of the common law trial that it's conducted like all the norms of any other court, with a prosecutor. Now the judge doesn't have the power that they have in these corporate de facto courts, where they can rewrite court records, dismiss juries. They're gods unto themselves. Judges are magistrates in a common law system. That is, they're legal advisors to the jury. They don't have the right to do any of that stuff. They are bound by the decision of the jury, and the jury, in fact, can even rewrite the law, can make a decision that some law may not be valid and should be chucked out. The people are empowered by the jury system to be the lawmakers, not just the legislators, but the jury members themselves. The citizens can directly make the law, and that's one of the very important aspects of the common law court. And also a very important thing, there are no lawyers. People represent themselves. You cannot be represented by another human being. If you have a case you want to bring, you have to be able to argue that case openly before the world, and the person accused has to come and answer those charges. So there's no intermediary where a lawyer can be, the lawyer and judge run courts are a big part of the problem. So, that's kind of in a nutshell the philosophy and the direction of a common law court. And don't forget, the verdict of a common law court has the force of law, and a police officer is obligated to enforce it. So if your common law court has decided that chemtrails are unconstitutional and are a threat to the health of people, the police have to go in and stop that chemtrail from operating, or they're colluding in a crime and they have to stand down. They're violating their oath of office, they're not being peace officers, and we have the right to appoint common law sheriffs to take their place. And in fact, the part of the establishment of the court involves the appointing of common law bailiffs and sheriffs to issue the warrants, to maintain peace in the court, to defend the jury in case they're attacked, to defend the viability of the court, and to make the arrests. So the common law sheriff is a very important and powerful figure in this whole process, just as in America, the county sheriffs have immense power to convene juries and remove corrupt judges, that kind of thing. That's why we need to get the sheriffs who exist now on board, bringing them into our training programs, our workshops, and teach them about the common law to get them on board and assist our common law courts. So again, if you want to read up on any of this, there'll be more workshops. Until then, follow that common law training manual at itccs.org. If you want to get a hold of me, I'm at hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com. And this is Kevin Annett. Thank you very much.